Welcome to ETM's Markets Magnified podcast. And I mean, as we are winding down 2024, what a year it's been. When we started in 2024, we all knew this was going to be the year of the election. I mean, it was a record number of elections across the globe happening, some very significant ones happening, maybe lesser, it flew a bit under the radar, but notably the European Parliament saw an election, Russia saw an election, there were snap elections in between, but of course the one that really took all the focus was the election in the US. And surprising to some, to this day, still scratching their heads, how did Donald Trump manage to get back into the Oval Office? And for this discussion today, I'm joined by Director of Econometrix, as well as the Chief Economist for the ETM Group, Dr. Azar Jammine. Azar, thank you very much for joining me for this discussion. There were a lot of tears post 5 November elections in the US. A lot of people didn't see this coming, and others went, we could have told you that this was going to happen, but here we are. Trump is back in the White House. How did he manage?
One has to recognize that there has been an incredible shift in the political landscape over the last few years, whereby you're finding that incumbents in leadership positions have failed to win elections. And that is a complete turnaround from situations that we've had historically in the past, where an incumbent in a particular leadership position tends to carry an advantage and tends to get re-elected to that position. And we've seen changes in that regard, not only in the US, but in many, many developed economies. And one needs to question why that has been the case, and why in particular you're seeing a radicalization of the political spectrum around the world. In particular, what we have been seeing is a rise in inequality of a kind that is polarizing society and encouraging the man in the street, the working class person, to rise up against the elite who are seen to be dominating the economic landscape and who are perceived to be exploiting the masses. And that doesn't apply only in the US, it applies in many other developed economies. The UK, we've seen a shift in political environment. France is in a complete turmoil at the moment, where we see radicalization both on the left and on the right. And to some extent, South Africa has been running against that kind of spirit, where we did see a move away from the government, from the incumbent, but not entirely towards the left. We have seen a strengthening of the right wing in South Africa as well. But in the US, quite clearly, Donald Trump won because the masses are perceiving that inequality has risen in the US, that the rich are getting richer and that the poor are getting poorer. Now, this is to some extent a misnomer. It's not that the poor are getting poorer. It's just that the rich are getting much richer. And in relation to that, the poor see themselves as getting poorer. It's interesting that in so many instances, you're seeing the leadership changing hands rather than remaining in office in developed economies. In developing countries, it's somewhat different. And much of that can probably be attributable to the fact that they are succeeding with higher economic growth rates than developed economies.
Yeah, we're seeing, and like you said, it's not only in the US, in Europe, where we're seeing these changes play out. I mean, Mauritius got a new government. Botswana has a brand new government. I know there's been some disputes in Mozambique, also some concerns in the Namibian election that recently happened. And then, of course, we have in South Africa the same thing, complete change of the guard. Well, not complete, but it is half a change of the guard of the ANC losing its majority. So it's undeniable. and I think there's more than one factor here at play, but it's definitely undeniable that the political ground at the very bottom is shifting. How it's going to play out, that remains a question to be seen. I mean, can we see a complete flip-flop? You mentioned now that we have a radicalization of both the left and the right. And one of the concerns that I have with this is that we swing from one to the other, meaning that we saw a Trump presidency, we saw a Biden presidency, now we're seeing another Trump presidency. Can we see that flip-flop back to a democratic support for the Democrats? And I think that kind of, because we are in these extreme environments, that flip-flopping is becoming, I think, a concerning risk, and something that just needs to also be checked as we move forward with with the next round of elections, when that is going to be. But something also in South Africa that you still wanted to speak on is also South Africa, amid all these changing environments, have taken up the leadership of the G20, right?
That is correct. And it's an incredibly challenging time to assume the presidency. It's probably the most challenging time of any of the G20 members' assumption of the presidency, because we're not talking here about BRICS, where you've got like-minded countries from a political angle. It's almost a club, if you want to call it that. The G20 incorporates the United States itself. And in fact, the US is set to assume the presidency of the G20 after South Africa. So, when they start dealing with a number of international issues, such as international trade, such as climate change, such as cybersecurity, those kind of issues, such as rising inequality and development, South Africa is likely to encounter a marked difference of opinion amongst many of the G20 leadership. And in particular here, of course, Trump versus the rest. And how South Africa navigates this is going to be very interesting to see. I personally believe that South Africa has a wonderful opportunity of actually collecting significant points of confidence if it maintains a strictly neutral stance on many of the issues that are going to be debated by the G20. Whether it will do so, one doesn't know, because, and in fact, you will have disparate views from within the Government of National Unity on the kind of responses that will be forthcoming. You're going to have, led by the Democratic Alliance, but some of the other political parties, support for moves towards dealing with climate change, but protecting globalization. And on the other side, you're going to have some of the pressures from within the ANC to really take a hard line against Trump and the West, basically, in that regard, and align ourselves more with the Eastern countries. And that's going to be quite a challenge to actually maneuver that clash between the different segments that are going to take place. But I believe that Ramaphosa himself, that's one of his strengths, has the wherewithal to actually navigate this quite appropriately and to actually get a benefit out of it. We are told that the holding of the presidency does carry some potentially huge benefits. The one thing is that there are going to be 130 international conferences being held in South Africa, with delegates and whole teams from each of these 20 leading economies of the world coming into the country. That can surely have a knock-on benefit for our tourism industry, and through that for the overall economy. But we have to wait to see whether that is the case.
Like you said, apart from the international shifts that's happening, South Africa is also still managing what effectively is a coalition government with the GNU. But I would like to know, what are your thoughts on how they've managed the process thus far?
I think the process has been managed reasonably thus far. I certainly didn't think that the GNU would be a bed of roses at all. There were some really clear discrepancies between the policies that were being pursued by the DA and those from the ANC. And that was bound to result in a lot of clashes, and we are seeing them almost on a daily basis. But somehow the government seems to have held firm, and I think what is driving it to remain intact is the fear that the alternative is too ghastly to contemplate. And whenever we go to the brink, we somehow are finding a solution. This is typical of South African politics over the last 4 decades, I must say. So that gives one a little bit of confidence. But we are going to have to see the translation of a lot of these attempts at structural reforms by the Government of National Unity translating into improved economic growth in the numbers to be seen, or else in a year's time, people will start becoming disillusioned with where we're going, and that could create all sorts of new political tensions that could be very, very disruptive. And a breakup of the GNU can have disastrous consequences for the country. The currency would plummet, our inflation would soar, interest rates would have to start rising, and economic growth could collapse as a consequence of that. But hopefully that won't be the case. And as I'm saying, I think the assumption of the G20 presidency can be used as a platform to, in a sense, almost unify South Africa on condition that very neutral stances are adopted on many of these issues. And that can help to enhance trade with both the East and the West, and through that eventually encourage increased investment into South Africa from these sources. One particular area of focus that South Africa, I think, it's an opportunity to take is South Africa is now the only representative or single country representative from the African continent. I know the AU has been given a unified voice as a specific delegate, but this does offer South Africa the opportunity to push the African agenda and basically increase pressure on developed countries to come to the assistance of Africa, not in terms of handouts, but in terms of providing loans that can facilitate development on the continent, and in particular in this whole move to a just transition to deal with climate change. Because if you look at the numbers at the moment of what is really required from an infrastructural point of view, what the world is calling on Africa to do to prepare itself for climate change and a switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy and other forms of energy, the amounts are astronomical. We're talking about $1 trillion per year. Now, there's no way Africa has anything close to that to be able to do it on itself. And the risk is that if African countries try and break their backs to try and fund this just transition on their own, they are going to run into massive public debts that will eventually sink their own economies. And the developed world needs to be brought to realize it. Funny enough, it's a challenge that the developed countries themselves face. So this is why it's going to be very interesting to see. But it is a challenge that I think South Africa can lead and lead successfully.
Look, you ignore Africa at your own peril, right? Because if we look at the declining birth rates in the developed countries, we all know that Africa is going to be the future. Whether it's going to be through immigration, whether it's going to be through for markets. Africa really deserves a much bigger seat at the table, as it is where the future opportunities are going to come from, economically speaking. But I just want to go back quickly for a minute. Do you think that because of our strong alignment with BRICS, that the neutrality ship has sailed in many of these geopolitical matters, or is there perhaps still a way to navigate this?
I do believe that there's still a way to navigate this. If you look at the way India has been behaving, it's somehow maintained a fairly neutral stance. It is a member of BRICS, and yet, I suppose because of its size, is still well sought after by the West and succeeding in actually managing that. So I don't see why South Africa can't do so, and I think it's in Africa's own interest to keep both the East and the West interested in the continent. And you're so right in highlighting the potential that exists in Africa from a population point of view. I was reading yesterday that the population of the European Union decreased by 500,000. The birth rate decreased by 500,000 in 1 year. That is extraordinary. That was from 5 million to 4.5 million new births. Now that's devastating and will have significant geopolitical consequences and demographic consequences and economic consequences in the longer term. So I think that message needs to be conveyed. The other one is that Africa still possesses some key minerals that, if the West wants to reduce its dependence on countries like China for those critical minerals in a world that is moving towards artificial intelligence and the need to embrace climate change and introduce all sorts of technology that is dependent on rare earth minerals and the like. Well, Africa is the source for these. Maybe not South Africa to some extent, but we are an alternative. So we do have an important role to play, also still to supply resources to the West.
I said this in a previous podcast, but it feels a lot like 2024 just really laid the foundation of what is going to be, dare I say, a volatile 2024, at least an interesting 2025, excuse me, not 2024. It's going to be an interesting 2025. And I think we're going to have to hold on to our bootstraps for next year's events.
Without a doubt, 2025 seems awesome in the true sense of the word, what awesome really means. And in particular, from a financial market point of view, the unknown factor here is what is going to happen to global interest rates. Will global inflation pick up as a result of the introduction of tariffs by Donald Trump? And reduced globalization? And is that going to have a negative impact on financial markets, which certainly in the US are at extremely high levels of valuation? So yes, one does enter 2025 with an undoubted sense of trepidation. But I think one must also try and keep a level mind here. I know that Donald Trump then last weekend threatened to impose a 100% tariff on imports from BRICS countries should they stand up and develop a currency of their own in competition with the US dollar. Well, that sounds very frightening on the face of it. But really, what are the chances that BRICS will actually develop a currency of its own within the next 4 years, which is the duration of the tenure of Trump's presidency? A lot of people are forgetting that Trump is going to be there for only 4 years, and that after that you could have a complete change again. In the interim, we also know that the BRICS countries, I know they've toyed with the idea of introducing a new currency. But actually, it wasn't the main focal point of the last BRICS conference in Kazan. Other issues were far, far more important. And that is partly because they recognize that we have a long way to go before we actually develop a unified alternative to the US dollar. It's a process that will take place over time. We've already seen the role of the dollar declining over the last 2 decades, from nearly 100%, but certainly from 70% of foreign exchange reserves down to 58%, and that process is going to continue. But you really, and then you think of what is the alternative? Why has the dollar's importance decreased? It's mainly because of the formation of the euro, which is seen as a viable alternative to the dollar up to a point. But then you ask yourself, well, how did the Eurozone form its own currency? And that meant introducing very strict requirements for countries to adopt budget deficits of less than 3% of GDP and public debts of less than 60% of GDP in order to qualify. Now, when you look at the likes of Saudi Arabia, Iran, South Africa, Brazil, India, Russia, China, wow, there's huge disparities in the way that they are managing their economies, unlike the European countries, which had a lot more similarity in that manner. So for to move towards a unified currency is a tall order, and it's not going to happen in the next 4 years. And I'm sure Trump knows that, but all he's doing is using this as a negotiating tactic to try and bully countries into giving the US what it wants. And so I don't think we should be too intimidated by it.
His strong arm tactics, I mean, that's what the man is known for. Well, we'll find out exactly how far he's going to go in those tactics when he enters the White House and the Oval Office on the 5th of November, I think is the inauguration. So I think that will set really the course for what we're going to see happen throughout 2025. Azar, thank you as always for your time. It's end of the year, so we will likely only catch up again next year. Get some rest, because like we say, 2025, it's going to be an awesome one.
Thank you. Thank you, and blessed Christmas and festive season for our clients. Thank you.